Welcome. Thank you for coming this evening. We're happy to have you here. We're excited to welcome Robert P. Jones, the author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. I'm Pastor Diane Loffman, the pastor here at First Lutheran Church, FLC Faith Love Community. Robert's book became a New York Times bestseller upon its release in September of 2023, and we're grateful that he's with us to share his perspective and insights as our inaugural speaker of the First Lutheran Church Foundation's Dialogue in Action series. We're pleased also to begin with music selections performed by Aaron Aldridge and Alexander Sandor. We are grateful for their talent and contribution to this event and for they are helping to set the tone for the evening. Aaron Aldridge is a highly sought-after performer and pedagogue who has performed throughout the U.S., Europe, Asia, and South America. She has been broadcast on NPR, BBC, Minnesota Public Radio, and Wisconsin Public Radio. She is the Duluth Superior Symphony Orchestra concertmaster and also the concertmaster of the Lyric Opera of the North Orchestra. She is a member of the Bluegrass Americana folk-based band Danny Frank and the Smoky Gold. Alexander Sandor is a freelance pianist and teacher in northern Wisconsin. He is an adjunct piano instructor at UW Superior, a soloist at ragtime festivals throughout the country, and the president of the Lake Superior Ragtime Society, Incorporated. In 2016, with the Lake Superior Chamber Orchestra and Maestro Warren Friesen, Sandor performed the United States premiere of the long-neglected Concerto for Piano and Winds by Belgian composer Leo Smit. I invite Aaron and Alexander forward, and Aaron's going to say a few words about the pieces they have selected for this evening. Let us welcome them.
Good evening, and thank you all so much for having us. We're thrilled to be here. So I thought I would say a little bit about each piece before each piece. So I wanted to start with a piece that is near and dear to my heart and is really a favorite. And this is by American jazz composer, conductor, and musician from Indianapolis, David Baker. He also happened to be my teacher when I went to Indiana University. And at Indiana University, he was the professor of jazz studies at the Jacobs School of Music. And not only did I get to take classes with him, I also got to play several of his compositions. And not only was he just a brilliantly talented man, but also one of the nicest and coolest people you ever wanted to meet. He is known as an educator and founder of the jazz studies at IU. From 1991 to 2012, he was the conductor and musical and artistic director for the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra. He has more than 65 recordings, 70 books, and 400 articles to his credit. He received the James Smithson Medal from the Smithsonian Institution, an American Jazz Masters Award, a National Association of Jazz Educators Hall of Fame Award, and a Governor's Arts Award from the state of Indiana, just to name a few. He expanded the role of the composer as a voice of African American music history. Originally a jazz trombonist and recording artist who performed with noted musicians Slide Hampton, Wes Montgomery, Maynard Ferguson, and Quincy Jones, he started as a trombonist and then had a really bad accident that hurt his embouchure, and he could no longer play the trombone. And instead of giving up, he said, great, I'm gonna learn cello. And really lucky for us, because he wrote so many great string works. And what he is known for is what we call third stream jazz. So it's the blending of classical and jazz elements. This is a piece called Deliver My Soul for violin and piano, and he rewrote it from his Psalm 22 for chorus. It is a gospel blues hybrid, idiomatic to the violin and deeply rooted in the blues form and style, and we hope you enjoy. Now for something a little bit different. So the next piece we're going to play for you is the first movement from one of Beethoven's most significant violin sonatas, which seems a weird thing to say because really all the violin sonatas are pretty important, but this was a pretty special one. And he composed this in 1803. And this is one of the works we divide Beethoven's periods into early, middle, and late. And by this time, he was profoundly deaf. And he wrote a very famous testament called the Heiligenstadt Testament, and where he was questioning if he should even live because how can I be I be a musician and lose my hearing? And then kind of by the end of the letter, he said, you know what, I'm going to triumph over this, and I'm going to just compose. I won't be able to be the pianist I am, but I will be able to compose because I can hear the music in my head. And so he wrote a significant amount of works that embodied this sort of triumph, you know, good versus evil, triumph, that sort of thing, including Symphony Number 5, also Symphony Number 3, the Waldstein, the Appassionato piano sonatas, and then this sonata, the Kreutzer. So there was a new violinist in Vienna that spring of 1803 that Beethoven's patron put together, and his name was George Augustus Bridgetower. And he made his debut in Paris at the age of 10. And they premiered the Kreutzer Sonata. And in fact, on the night of the concert, the manuscript hadn't been done, so Bridgetower was actually reading over his shoulder to look at the music, which I will not be doing. This is very different from the sonatas that came before it because he treated this sonata very much like a symphony and that kind of approach. And sort of the funny anecdote, because you might be saying, well, why is it called the Kreutzer Sonata? Well, here's why. Shortly after the concert that Bridgetower and Beethoven did together, they quarreled over a woman. And according to Bridgetower's recollection, years after Beethoven had died, Bridgetower returned to England and Beethoven dedicated this sonata. It was originally going to be dedicated to Bridgetower, and then he got mad with him and said, that's it, I'm done with you. And he named it after the French violinist Rodolphe Kreutzer. Kreutzer found this sonata completely baffling and never performed it. So there you go. Anyways, this is the first movement from Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata. Thank you so much. The final piece we're going to play for you is the last movement of Camille Saint-Saëns' Sonata No. 1 in D minor. And Saint-Saëns was a genuine prodigy of wide-ranging talent and interests. He composed in almost every form and medium then imaginable. His first violin sonata dates from 1885, after Saint-Saëns had already composed his 3 violin concertos. It was also the year right before he composed his popular organ symphony, which, by the way, is also the theme song to Babe. I have to point that out every time I say it. So the connection between Saint-Saëns and Beethoven is that Saint-Saëns loved the Beethoven violin sonatas and wanted to emulate them. And this is his shot at doing that. Saint-Saëns jokingly told his publisher that the piece should be called the Hippogriff Sonata, insinuating that only a mythical creature like the hippogriff, which is a half-winged griffin and half-horse, I did not know that before I looked this up, could play the violin part. And I'm not sure what mythological character the piano would be either. So anyways, this is a favorite of ours. It's one of the hidden gems of the violin piano sonata repertoire, and we hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for having us.
Well, that's a great way to start an evening. Thank you, Aaron and Alexander. Just a few notes on tonight. At the end of Dr. Jones' presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. This is a dialogue series, so dialogue with our speaker and dialogue following afterwards in the parish hall with Pastor Denise Shear, who is the chair of our racial justice team here at First Lutheran, and she will facilitate a breakout session in the parish hall on the London Road level. If you go to the breakout, please pick up your refreshments beforehand. So that's just the start of the dialogue this evening that we hope will extend beyond this night into the community and into the months and years ahead. So you have a question card, and think of your questions and write those down, and we will collect them after Dr. Jones' speech and our presentation. This free event is presented by the First Lutheran Church Foundation. The Foundation's mission for the series is to raise awareness through education, to inspire action, and to foster community engagement. If you wish to contribute to help defray the cost, use the QR code in your program book. Under Funds, scroll down to Speaker Series. Your program book also lists other donation methods, and at the end there's collection plates as you exit the sanctuary, and we appreciate, of course, all gifts. We thank the Endowment Development Services for being our premier corporate sponsor of this event, our platinum sponsors, Becky and Paul Kilgore, and Mary and Jim Zastro, and our gold sponsors, Vince and Nancy Magnuson, and also Vickers Inn for providing complimentary lodging for Robert. We thank our additional generous sponsors listed in your program book. In addition, we would like to recognize the Westminster Town Hall Forum for their invaluable guidance during this, our inaugural year. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Robert P. Jones. Dr. Jones is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and a leading scholar and commentator on religion and politics. Jones regularly writes about politics, culture, and religion for the Atlantic, Time, and Religion News Service. He is frequently featured in major national media such as MSNBC, CNN, NPR, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He holds a Ph.D. in religion from Emory University and an M.Div from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Along with his best-selling book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, he is the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award, and The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. He writes a regular Substack newsletter at robertpjones.substack.com. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much. So good to be with you tonight. And wow, that was so amazing, right? I was so thrilled when I heard there was going to be music. I didn't realize it was going to be such a hard act to follow in the beginning. But I do think the one good thing it does for us is it helps us, I think, put a little buffer zone between the day we've had and what we're here to talk about tonight and experience and think about. So let me just kind of invite you, into the space tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about a journey that I've been on, writing this book, a journey that took me across the country, and particularly to three places that I feature in the book. I have spoken at the other two, right? So in the book I write about the Mississippi Delta and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Duluth. So I am closing the circle tonight, being with you here tonight. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do that. And, the book title, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and The Path to a Shared American Future, has a kind of backward and forward-looking perspective built into the title. And it is a book of history, but it's also about our present and our future. Our history, we obviously can't change, but we can harness it to seize our present and to shape our future. And I can't help but noticing these little tables down here on front. I love these on these carpets for children down here. And this is mostly an adult conversation tonight, but I can't help but think that part of what we're up to here is thinking about what the little bodies that will sit in these chairs, what future they're going to live into, right? What future we're going to hand to them going forward. So I just invite you to kind of reflect on these as we're having this conversation tonight. So I'm going to open with a claim. It's a claim about vision. And I think in many ways that's what history helps us do. It helps us see. It helps us see the past. It helps us see the future. And this claim is fairly basic, but I think it's fundamental to where we are as a country right now. It's this: to be free and to live authentic human lives, we must know who we are. And to know ourselves, we have to know where we came from. And for the vast majority of those who think of ourselves as white and identify as Christian, which I am guessing we're here in this space, that's a lot of us. It's certainly not all of us, but it's a lot of us in this room. It's certainly me. Here's the claim. We are and have been suffering from collective self-delusion. I'm going to unpack, I think, what I mean by that. And again, this journey that I've been on as someone who grew up thinking of myself as white, identifying as Christian, and trying to wrestle with the ways in which this idea of white supremacy and Christian superiority really ran through my faith and distorted, I think, the way that I saw the world. Now, I think no one saw this truth more clearly, really, in the late 20th century than James Baldwin. He has shaped my thinking a lot. James Baldwin's light was especially incandescent in the months following the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And in July of 1968, he was giving an interview with Esquire magazine against the backdrop of American cities burning across the country. And the interviewer literally asked him, how do we get blacks to cool it? That was the question, right, from the interviewer at Esquire magazine. Baldwin's response was this: all that can save you now is your confrontation with your own history, which is not your past, but your present. Your history has led you to this moment, and you can only begin to change yourself by looking at what you were doing in the name of your history. You can only begin to change yourself by looking at what you were doing in the name of your history. So Baldwin gave this interview the year that I was born. And more than half a century later, it's still an insight that I think lays bare the roots of our present troubles. I do want to give a big thanks to Pastor Loftman and Jim Jastrow for the hosting me tonight, and thanks for the work that's been done in this community. I feature Duluth in the pages of the book, and it's about a third of the book, because of the work that many of you in this room have been doing for decades to try to tell the truth, to try to bring about healing, to try to build a different future. So I'm really thrilled that my journey has intersected with your journey here in this place, and that we're still really talking about where we want to go. So I want to honor the work that you've been doing, seeking a more honest way to look at the way white supremacy has shaped our history, and using that knowledge to shape a better future together, and to also acknowledge we still have a long road ahead. So I want to start with a story that's at the beginning of the book, and I won't do a lot of reading from the book, but I want to start with the story that I begin the book with. I didn't come to it until fairly late in the research process, but I ended up putting it right in the front of the book that I think helps us really understand, I think, some difficult truths about our nation and ourselves. So this is right up front in the book, and I'm going to kind of just read this piece. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade raft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin making plans to escape north. The Hickman Party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering group with so many children aboard, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight and knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesota with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as his final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee in Lowertown on the outskirts of St. Paul. As local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that St. Paul police arrived on the scene. But after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with his trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th. But they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people who had been held under armed guard all winter following the Dakota War of the year before, in a miserable encampment in a lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation downriver from their ancestral homelands to a bleak reservation in the Nebraska Territory. By the time the ice finally melted and the river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo. 547 Dakota people, whom he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from man." Neither Hickman and his companions nor the Dakota people would have had the perspective to realize they were witnessing a momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups presented on that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River, that the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they certainly would have been unaware that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. This encounter on May 5th, 1863, contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tell a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri and the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters and stories of indigenous people populating this land for millennia? Or do we portage east and cross the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. And I would argue that in this story, 160 years ago, we again see the seeds of our present troubles. We see European interactions fueled by the idea of the superiority of European civilization that entitled them to the land and labor of others. But as troubling as that is, it doesn't really capture the whole truth, the audacity of the claim, which is necessary to understand our present. And that one is a Christian claim. That we have to grasp the foundational role that Christian theology and Christian institutions wielded as weapons, the role that they played in justifying those claims of superiority. So for the past 10 years, I've been on this journey to really try to uncover the truth about my own history, someone who grew up white and Christian in the South, especially as it relates to these three identities, being white, being Christian, being American. And I'm still amazed at the power that these interlocking identities have to obscure the plain testimony of history and the stark realities of the present. And I've been struck by the ability of Christianity in particular to project for us a history of impossible innocence, both by hiding and denying our heritage. So my talk tonight is really about this journey to understand what I'm coming to see as America's identity crisis. Then clearly trying to identify the worldview that's at the root of this crisis, the version of Christianity that landed on these shores from Europe. So I want to take a minute to talk about one central thing something I actually didn't know about that is so key to understanding the role that Christianity played in justifying these claims and the entire colonial settler project. And it's this thing called the doctrine of discovery, right? And again, it's notable today that we are arguing in our politics so much about identity and history, right? We're arguing even less about policy, but so we're banning library books about history, right? We're arguing over curriculum. School boards have become battlegrounds here, and it is all about this idea of history. And it's important to kind of realize that and kind of take that in. What's that about? Why are we so arguing about our history? One that, not too long ago, we had this argument over 1776 versus 1619, right, as the origin story of America. Now, we're sitting here in a church, right, and we are very familiar with origin stories in religious traditions. In fact, if you open up either the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, you will find right up front, what? Genesis, right? And it starts with, in the beginning, right? It's an origin story. And it starts that way because it tells us something about who we are. It's like that "you are here" marker on those little maps, right? In the beginning, and it's that next word tells you something about the claims, right, of the Torah and the Christian Bible. In the beginning, God, right? It's a monotheistic claim. So we know from the very beginning there's a monotheistic story being asserted here from the very beginning. So these origin stories are very important for everything that follows, right? And so I think it's one of the reasons why we are fighting. What is the origin story of America? When do we start that frame? And so I grew up in the 70s, and I was collecting stamps, and I remember in 1776, right, the bicentennial came with all these kind of patriotic stamps. And I remember one in particular. It was 1776, and it was a painting that they actually put in the postage stamp of all those guys in Philadelphia, all the white guys in Philadelphia in their colonial finery with their quill pens, and they're all kind of posed awkwardly so you can see all of them, right, signing the Declaration of Independence. And I was thinking about that as a kind of opening image of the story. So what story do you have to tell about America if it's in the beginning, that image, right? Well, it's a bunch of white guys in a room signing some documents. And so you can tell a fairly straightforward story from that. And I think one of the big reasons why the 1619 Project caused so much controversy is because it basically said, yeah, no, not that, this, right? So it backed us up, and it said, let's tell us, what happens if we say, in the beginning, 1619? And now, I don't know how many of you remember, that it's become a book and a curriculum and all that now, but the original piece came out in the New York Times, right? And there was actually an image that accompanied that initial New York Times piece. Anybody remember that image? I think a lot of people have forgotten that there was this stark image there, but I think it's really important. The image was an endless ocean, right? It was dark, monochromatic image. It was almost black waters on the top, a gray sky, and this just horizon line. So think the lake, right? This infinite horizon line there. And it was that image. It was 1619 and that image. So what story do we have to tell about ourselves if we rewind the clock, start the image, there, and we have to start with that image. We have to explain what that image was, right? And of course, that image was about transatlantic slave trade. And we have to tell that as the beginning story of America. And I think this is like really important, and why this has become so fraught, because those in the beginnings contain the seeds of who we are today and the story that we have to tell about ourselves today. So in the book, I want to kind of applaud the 1619 project and then offer a kind of friendly amendment that we have to kind of keep going back, right? And one of the reasons why I came to that is that in 1619, the interaction between Europeans and indigenous people was more than 100 years old by the time we get to 1619. So what I'm arguing in the book is kind of take it back, take the frame back even a little bit further, just keep expanding the lens back. And I'm arguing in the book that one year that we ought to all have seared in our memories is yes to 1619, and we ought to kind of bring it back one more frame, and it's the year 1493. Right? It works every time. Yes, 1493. So not the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, or that little rhyme that we all learned, in elementary school, 1492, so Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but 1493. Because what happens in 1493? Most of us, including me, didn't get taught anything about what happened in 1493, really. So what happens is he goes back, right? Columbus goes back to Spain, and he says, look, I've discovered these lands. He still doesn't really know where he is, but I've discovered these lands, and I need a bunch of things. I need more ships. I need more supplies. I need more soldiers. I need more missionaries. And then the thing that gets overlooked, and I think this is so critical for us and our culture today, is the other thing he asked for is a moral and religious mandate for what he's about to do, right? And so they give him the ships, the supplies, and all of that. And who does he look to give him this moral mandate for the entire colonial project? He looks to the Christian church to get this moral mandate. And it turns out that the Christian church has been wrestling with this for the whole second half of the 15th century. And there are actually a series of papal documents that were collectively are called the Doctrine of Discovery, where the Christian church in Europe is wrestling with this question. And it caused a kind of theological controversy or a theological conundrum. It's like, well, what do we do with these people and these lands? We had no idea they even existed. And the central question was, what rights do these people have that we European Christians are bound to respect? That was the central question that Columbus was wanting a definitive answer to. And he essentially got it through these series of papal bulls between 1452 and the last one, 1493, specifically addressing Columbus's concerns. What those documents essentially say is they answered that question of what rights do these people have that we're bound to respect with a question of their own. And that question was, are they Christian? Now, of course, they knew the answer, right, to that question. Of course, they were not Christian, but they used a kind of logic they had already used with Jews and Muslims and other people that they knew about. And if the answer was no, in these documents, it spells out that they are to be considered, quote unquote, enemies of Christ, right? And as enemies of Christ, they essentially lose their rights. Right, so it gives people then the right, Europeans who are sailing under the flag of a Christian queen or king and under the authority of the church to seize their land, to steal their goods, and then in the documents itself, it's like written in black and white from the hand of the Pope, and to submit their persons to perpetual slavery. Right, that's like written out. Now, I know we're in a Protestant church, so unless there's any of you Protestants here getting a little smug that this is coming from the Catholic Church and from the Pope, and this is not your concern, this is prior to the Protestant Reformation, right? So there are no Protestants in the world. Everyone in Europe who is Christian is under the authority of the Pope and these documents. If there's any Anglicans in here getting all squirrely, it's also before the break with the Church of England, right? So again, all of Western Europe is really under the authority of the Pope, and that's why it's essentially the closest thing to international law that exists at the time. And this is the thing that really gets the entire project really off the ground, this kind of connecting of political and economic opportunism, a theological crisis, and then this theological justification there. And what gets built out of that is this idea of the superiority of Christianity and Western civilization. And you will see that pairing over and over again in American history: Christianity and civilization. And the argument was, look, yes, these people are losing their lands, their goods, their freedom, and their lives, perhaps, but all of that is outweighed by the fact that we are giving them Christianity and civilization. You'll see that weighting there in the argument. Now, this all sounds like it's all very far behind us, kind of back in the 15th century and going forward, but lest you think it's too far back there, I'm going to kind of bring it up to date here with a few things. One of them is we can see this in our founding documents and laws. I kind of trace this through in the book, but just a kind of few examples. The Declaration of Independence I've already mentioned. We think of it as having these kind of high principles at the beginning, and it does. But if you keep reading the Declaration of Independence, it also has a list of grievances against the king. And among those grievances are some that read like this. He, the king, has excited domestic insurrections among us, and he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So that's right out of the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution, Section 2, specifically excludes Indians and counts enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, but then only for the purpose, right, of expanding the power of their white owners in there. It gets incorporated. This idea of the doctrine of discovery actually is the thing that drives the Louisiana Purchase. It gets embedded into our Supreme Court law in 1823 in a pretty famous case called Johnson v. McIntosh, where Chief Justice John Marshall says this, again, citing exactly this Christian doctrine. The character and religion of the New World's inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. The potentates of the Old World found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they had made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the New by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity. Right? There's the exchange. The doctrine of discovery is actually cited as late as 2005 in a Supreme Court decision in footnote number 1 in a ruling against the Oneida Nation, who were trying to reincorporate some of their land into their reservations, and that came from the pen of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right, one of our liberal justices on the court, not one of the conservative justices on the court. So this history, right, complicates the story of our founders and our founding, and one of the things I kind of came to in the book is that in the past it was common for even well-meaning, even progressives, to talk about in America, we need to solve the so-called Negro problem. Like that was a common phrase used, or we need to solve the Indian problem in the U.S. But I'm going to put it to you a different way. The analysis and a kind of a different reading of the history is that if we push past the so-called Negro problem and we push past the so-called Indian problem, at the headwaters, we find something that we're still wrestling with, and that is the white Christian problem at the root of all of this. So is this all ancient history? Well, one of the things that I have done besides kind of tracing this up through is the organization I run, Public Religion Research Institute, regularly ask people, we interview Americans of all walks of life on a whole range of issues. So we actually have been polling on this and asking Americans what they thought about this idea, because I was really curious, like if I really crystallize this claim of the doctrine of discovery and ask Americans today, what do they think about that? It turns out that we ask, and we put it in a survey and really ask people fairly straightforwardly, do you agree or disagree that God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians? Like, put it straightforwardly that way. 3 in 10 Americans today agree with that statement, phrased exactly that way. And there's 2 groups in which there are a majority who agree with those statements. One of them are self-identified Republicans, and the other one are self-identified white evangelical Protestants, and both of those, a majority of the group agrees with the kind of core tenets of this very, very old doctrine that's kind of at the heart, I think, of so many of our problems. So I think that Baldwin's assessment from 50 years ago was essentially right, that the only thing that can save us now, all of us, I think, but especially those of us who think of ourselves as white, identify as Christian, is an honest confrontation not only with the facts of our history, but what we're currently doing, right, with that history in our present. And I'm going to close with a kind of word at the end of the book. I have a section that I call it, confession and call, a word to my fellow white Christians at the end of the book. So I'm going to kind of close with that little mini sermon here at the end. Here's the question that must illuminate the path forward for us and our children. How can we meaningfully respond to being the beneficiaries of a crime so plain it cannot be denied and so large it can never fully be righted? It's easy to be overwhelmed by such a question. Even those conversations about restitution or reparations that get off the ground are quickly sandbagged by assertions about the impossibility of the task, or red herring objections about the impossibility of or about extreme solutions that no one's really proposed. But if we're honest, we also know that the paralysis that often cripples discussions of justice is a defense mechanism, stemming from a lack of real motivation. Up to this point in our history, the lesson seems to be this: while we are endlessly creative in fashioning novel ways to kill, dispossess, and defraud others, we are hopelessly unimaginative in our efforts to balance the scales of justice. Greed spawns a million schemes, while repentance throws up its hands. Now, tackling this question is a tall order, but we cannot shrink before the difficulty of the task. The creativity of our solutions is directly proportional to and a measure of the strength of our convictions. Our better angels must energize us now as much as our worst have in the past. We white Christians no longer represent the majority of Americans. We are no longer capable of setting the nation's course by sheer cultural and political dominance. But there are still more than enough of us to decisively derail the future of democracy in America. If we wish to do otherwise, we can no longer disingenuously pretend that democracy and the doctrine of discovery are or ever were compatible. We can no longer pay tribute to the one while benefiting from the other. We must choose. And if we choose democracy, it will require more than just confession by an unflinching few. It will require joining the work already underway to repair the damage done by this malignant cultural legacy. Through that transformative engagement, we might finally illuminate the path that leads to a shared American future. Thank you.
Now we'll have time to ask our questions, so I encourage you to take the card that you have in your program and write down any question you have, and then you can hold it up, and the ushers will pick that up. So you can start doing that. Once again, we want to thank our premier sponsor, Endowment Development Services, and the donors in your program book. We do have Vickers, the bookstore here, selling Dr. Jones' book, so you can purchase that afterwards and have a chance to speak to Dr. Jones and have him sign that. And then again, you are invited downstairs to continue the conversation. We also would like to thank WDIO TV and news anchor Renee Passau for their coverage of this series. I have a few questions. Do you have your questions? Get those questions written down. Certainly, you have challenged us and also, I think, given us hope as we work towards a shared American future. I have a couple questions here we can start with as you write down your own. You clearly lay out how the doctrine of discovery is such a pivotal document for understanding our Western colonization culture. How and where did you become aware of it and its stunningly broad influence? which in some ways I think you've answered. But what accounts for its ability to stay hidden in plain sight all these years?
Yeah, well, I put the word hidden in the title, right, for in many ways. I think it was just such a dominant assumption. I mean, you think about just, it's in our vocabulary, it's in our DNA, words like manifest destiny, right? Even some of our more progressive singers, this land is your land, this land is my land, right? From California to the New York Islands, right? Sea to shining sea. This is all this idea, right, that there was this divine mandate, right, that people of European descent and Christian identity were to be the occupiers. The idea of America as a new promised land. This is all like very familiar, right? It's just in the water. So I think it was such a dominant assumption that it has really only been fairly recently, right? That it's been, I think, those layers have started to be pulled away. Part of it is because of demographic change. I think that the country is a lot more diverse now, and it's not, white Christians in the country. We do a lot of demographic tracking, but it's only been the last 20 years that we have moved from being a country that was a majority white and Christian to one that's no longer a majority white and Christian. 20 years ago, 54% of the country identified as white and Christian. Today, that number is 42% identify as white and Christian. So I think that has also been a real shift of accountability and reckoning with a different kind of history.
So this question kind of dovetails with that. As a white Christian male, what steps can I take to feel less threatened by the pluralistic society we are turning into?
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the resistance. One thing I didn't say, in here that I sometimes say when I'm giving talks, particularly in predominantly white spaces, it's tough, I think, to challenge some of these things that have been so deeply ingrained in us. It's been, I mean, there's certainly times where I've been deeply, deeply uncomfortable. There have been times when I've been like reading something or even writing something, and I've had to just I got to take a walk, right? I just have to push back. I have to kind of take a breath. But I think the challenge, for me, has been sitting. I often use the language of sitting with the discomfort. I actually wrote a piece one time reflecting on this called "The Sacred Gift of White Discomfort." Right? That there is a gift to sitting if you stay with it, right? And I think the thing that I came to kind of late in the process is part of it was like, okay, I need to know this history because I just need to know it. But James Baldwin was so helpful, I think, to me in realizing that, I've got something at stake, right? And it's not just something I'm supposed to be doing for someone else or for some abstract justice concept, but if I'm going to know who I am, I've got to face this part, right? To really understand who I am and to live with authenticity and integrity going forward. So I think, there is a threat and there's a fear, I think, that in letting go of some of that stuff, but that sometimes that's all you can see, but what's on the other side of it is healing, repair, authenticity. I'll just give one quick example. So in 2011, I was diagnosed with colon cancer, and I was given kind of 50-50, stage 3, right? Really scary stuff. And then many of you have been through something like this, or a loved one has been through it, right? And they lay out this regimen of chemotherapy and surgery and all this stuff, and you're like, okay, right? But you sign on to all of that because you were hoping on the other side there is health. And I feel like in many ways, these difficult conversations, facing this difficult history, I think if more of us who look like me think about it that way, that on the other side of this, right, is freedom and health and authenticity, and all of that we're held back from, right, if we don't face it. So.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. I'm wondering, this is my own question, and what I promised some of my members you would talk about is Christian nationalism.
Oh.
So can you just give, I know that's big, but can you give just a little bit of how is that connected? How does that come out of the doctrine of discovery?
Well, you don't know how perfect that question is. The paperback version of the book is coming out in September, and so I got to write 1,500 words as a new afterword, and the title of the afterword is Christian Nationalism and the Doctrine of Discovery.
Oh.
Right. So
I did not know that. That was
so
not a
plan
whatsoever.
I've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, I think essentially this new thing that we're experiencing called Christian, that we've been kind of calling Christian nationalism, sociologists, people in the media, it's a label to describe this new movement, but it's not new, right? It is really the same old claim, like that this is a country of, by, and for European Christians. Like that's the central claim behind that movement. And so I think it's very much there. And we even have data. So we did a survey, big national survey with the Brookings Institution at PRRI, and again found that about 3 in 10 Americans identify as or can be identified as Christian nationalists. And when we cross-tab that set of questions, and these are questions like, do you agree that U.S. law should be based on the Bible? The U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation. To be American, to be truly American, you have to be Christian. Those kinds of questions. People who agree with those things, and we cross-tab that with the question about God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians, it's nearly 9 in 10 who, if you believe this, you believe that, right? So it is absolutely under, no pun intended, under the hood of that worldview. Yeah.
I agree with your position. I'm wondering what kind of comments you hear from those who don't agree with you.
Oh yeah, well, there's plenty of responses from those who don't, both on social media and in our mailbox and in my inbox, my email inbox. But it's interesting though that I will say this, that I have found I've been in about 120 churches over the past couple of years, and I found and these are mostly predominantly white congregations. A real openness, and not just in New England or California, but like in Kentucky and Georgia and South Carolina and Mississippi. And I think there is a hunger, I think, for actually having these conversations. And now we hear a lot about the kind of doubling down, and that's certainly out there. But I think there's also enough people who are actually genuinely trying to have these conversations. I mean, last month I was at a Baptist church in Dallas, right, who was really trying to have this conversation there, and in a milieu that is not at all friendly to that conversation, but still trying to have it. So I'm actually a little bit hopeful that these conversations are continuing to push forward, and I will say that a lot of the wins we're seeing in the blow are pushback. Right, so the library book banning, the kind of curriculum revisions, banning AP African American history, like those kinds of things, that's a pushback, right? But that means that a wind is blowing, right, that they're having to kind of resist. So.
It's Pentecost on Sunday. I like that.
Yeah.
Wind is blowing. What are some of the creative ideas for reparations for African heritage and indigenous Americans that you have encountered? So, which some are in your book, but maybe you want to.
Sure, I'll give a few examples. So what I like about a lot of what I'm seeing on the ground is they're local, and they're not kind of way up here. Now, as you know, if you remember this church and kind of feel the LCA, the Episcopal Church, are at the denomination level are doing things and actually setting up reparations funds that many of which have serious money behind them. Places like I live in Washington D.C. Georgetown University, right, has been doing some work, realizing that their university, their Jesuit Catholic university, actually sold enslaved people to balance the books when the university was in trouble early in its life, and they've actually tried to track down the descendants of many of those folks and are kind of offering scholarships, other kinds of assistance to them. My wife's from Evanston, Illinois. Just north of Chicago, and they had a history, like almost every community in the country, of redlining, right? And that real estate practice of ensuring that some neighborhoods were white only, and not kind of a collusion by realtors and the state and banks to not allow any non-white people in certain neighborhoods. And they've set up a reparations program in Evanston that's just local to Evanston. That says that if your family, if you can show that your family was denied loans, denied housing, you can apply, and they actually have money that is available for people for down payments on houses, rent assistance, those kinds of things. So I think, again, what I think the big picture for me was what was so stunning about reading these encounters, and many of you may have seen Killers of the Flower Moon, right, which is kind of connected to the Tulsa story I tell in the book. And what is so remarkable is, and I hinted at this in the last passage, how creative people were in defrauding people, right? Stealing property, finding loopholes, making laws that looked like they weren't racist on the face of them, but were absolutely intended to kind of, advantage white people over non-white people, or advantage white over indigenous people. Just an endless array of creativity when it came to that stuff. And yet, I think in many times we're like, oh, well, we wouldn't really know who to compensate, or we really wouldn't know who was wronged. And, but if we applied the same amount of energy and creativity to the kind of reparations and restitution process, there would be thousands and thousands of things. Some of them are certainly not going to work that well, but some of them will, right? And I think that's the thing I'm hoping that we'll see more of, is these kind of local creative efforts where people say we have to do something. So what can we do?
This is kind of continuation of that. From your research, is there anything we can learn from other countries and how to meaningfully respond to the issues presented tonight?
Yeah, I mean, so I had the opportunity to be in Berlin last spring and was struck, there by the commemoration. Maybe you may have been, that everything from the kind of Holocaust big memorial to book burning, memorials where there were book burnings, to those little stumble stones, those bronze stumble stones where there was a Jewish family that was abducted and killed, and they had their names and their dates like on the sidewalk right by the house there. And that kind of marking and commemoration and remembering and in the service of a different kind of a never again kind of future there. I was really struck by that. I haven't been to South Africa, but I kind of studied that as well. But here's the thing that's standing between us and something like that, is that in Germany there was a real acknowledgement of what happened, right? And a real acknowledgement of the way that the Nazi Party and Nazi ideology took over society and took over the church there, right? And a real struggle with that. In South Africa, there's an acknowledgement that this is like, we had an apartheid state. I think until we get to a place where we're willing to say, look, we are all the survivors of an American apartheid state. Like, that's who we are. That's what our history says to us. But like, until we get there and own that, right, it's hard to kind of move forward, I think, with a lot of serious restitution until we get really to own the ways. And it's so wild, right, that there's that much denial. And like, if I say that, there's sometimes like a gasp in the room, like this is an American apartheid state, it's unpatriotic and all that, stuff. But I mean, you can't go to any city in America and have that not be the plain thing you see in front of you, right? From where people still live, every city in the country, north, south, east, west, all segregated, right, by race. Income disparities all run along racial lines. Indigenous people hunker down on reservations, right? And also all kinds of disparities, income, health disparities as well there. Like, all the plain evidence is right in front of us, and yet we're resistant, right, to even hearing that about ourselves. But I think if we can get there, right, we've got, if you're Christian, we have some tools for that, right? Repentance and what the full meaning of what repentance looks like. Yeah.
Have you spoken to high school and college students? This question is, what is their reception to their role in this path forward?
Yeah, not a lot of high school students. I do a lot of university seminary talks as well, and there's usually what's notable is that they know more of this history than I did. I mean, I didn't know. I've got a Ph.D. right in religion from Emory University. It's one of the top religion programs in the country, and I just was not taught about the doctrine of discovery. I can't tell you how many religious history classes I've had in the country and American history classes, and it just, I think it may have went by, maybe I heard something about it, but it was never put as something front and center of understanding our culture and certainly understanding the way that Christian theology has evolved in this country. But and I'll give you an example. My 14-year-old son is going to public school in Maryland, and he's taking AP American History right now, and I was like looking at his textbook, and it has like a pretty balanced story, right? That it's telling in a way that my textbooks simply did not have. And even in addition to that, they're not only reading a kind of pretty balanced AP American history textbook, but they're reading Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous History of America alongside that. And that's in a public school in Maryland. And so I think the younger generation is getting more of this and expects, I think, to have less of a kind of rah-rah us, and so I think the phrase that stay with me a lot is, we were fed this history of impossible innocence. That's the thing, that phrase is a kind of Baldwin-esque phrase, but it's kind of stayed with me a lot, of kind of realizing, no, we have to have a more mature, honest, view of our history.
Do you think that's the case across the country, or is that on
the
coast?
Yeah, certainly not. I mean, and what's notable is that, again, I come from the South, and, I went to public school in Jackson, Mississippi during a very short window of integration. The schools are essentially resegregated now all over the South, right? So there was a kind of 20, 25-year period where, and I went to public school during that period, but now all my nieces and nephews are in public school. They're essentially, not completely, but mostly resegregated. And it's because of the second wave of white flight that it's just kind of moved, all white people moved out again, a second wave. So I think, and then the other move, of course, is the move out of public schools, certainly in the South and many places in the Midwest, into segregation academies, right, where white parents just pulled their kids out of public school. And certainly in those schools where they're getting PragerU kinds of curriculum, and a lot of the homeschooling curriculum this is nowhere in that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a big issue.
Yeah.
So, ideas?
Well, it's certainly not the majority. I mean, the thing to remember is that is not the majority. So it's not a 50-50 thing. So as loud as white evangelicals are, and again, these are kind of my people, they're only 14% of the population today. Right? They're down from a quarter of a population 20 years ago to 14% of the population today. Only 1 in 10 young people identifies, like 8%, identify as white and evangelical. So it's a very small group of the youngest generation. Now it's a kind of loud and very defensive minority, but it's nowhere near the kind of majority in the younger generation. So they're kind of more and more isolated in a way that I think wasn't even true for me 20 years ago. So, yeah.
Should I give you a hard one?
These have been easy? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Most American Zionists are evangelical Christians. I don't know if you want to touch this one. Is militarized Zionism another form of manifest destiny? How are they related or distinct?
Yeah, I'd say I'm not really qualified to speak about the foreign policy side of this, but I can speak about the U.S. Side of it. It's very clear that this idea of a kind of promised land read straight out of the Bible, right, is very much influencing the way that we have thought about the U.S. In this culture. And the one thing I will say about that, about white evangelicals, I think it'll be out next week, actually. So I did do a whole piece on this with NPR's Code Switch podcast. If any of you have listened to that, and we were talking about this kind of instrumental way that particularly the white evangelical side of the Christian world thinks about Israel and its place, right? And so it's very much, and this is what's complicated about it, but I think one thing is kind of clear is that the kind of Zionism that white evangelicals support does not at all have the well-being of the Jewish people in mind at the end of the day, right? They are playing a bit part in a Christian drama, is the way that theology really works out, right? So that they are bringing about all of the stuff about the state of Israel and Jews returning to Israel and Jerusalem is all about bringing about the second coming of Jesus, when they will all either be converted or go to hell, right? So in that kind of premillennialist eschatology. So I think that's also kind of just a weird warped thing. But here in the U.S., I think we've got our own form, right, of that sense of. We used to sing, it may still be in the hymnals here. I don't know what is in the ECLA hymnal, but marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion, marching on to Zion, the beautiful city of God, right? It's and in many ways, Zion became America, right, for Christians in the U.S. I think that's certainly deeply problematic. Yeah.
And this is really taking it further back to our interpretation of the Hebrew tradition. God called Abram's family to go to a new land. How do we reinterpret our biblical tradition? I mean, you're speaking somewhat to that. That is behind.
So say it again. Sorry.
How do we reinterpret, because so much of Scripture is Zion and the Promised Land, so what's a different lens that we can approach that with?
Yeah, it's everywhere. I mean, I do think that's the challenge. Is I've been hearing of churches that actually are doing a kind of audit where they're actually kind of going back through a year's worth of liturgy, a year's worth of which hymns got picked, what's the lyrics, what got preached on, what didn't get preached on. To kind of think about, and also the other place to look is children's literature. Man, many of those children's Bibles, they are nothing but white people in those children's Bibles, right? And so kind of, what is that thing? Those little, I don't know, nobody uses those anymore, but I was there, I had those little felt people we put up on the felt board in Sunday school. They were all white, right? Moses, David, Jesus, they're all white, right? And so thinking about those kinds of things, and it's just deep, right? And also other hymns, like we also sing, like, wash me and I will be whiter than snow, Lord, whiter than snow. The kind of imagery of whiteness with purity. What does that mean? How do we think about that? So I think, it's 4 centuries, right, in our DNA. So the real question is, like, it's going to take a while, right, to kind of suss it out and to kind of have it kind of work out of the system. But I think we've got, a role to play in kind of deliberately kind of surfacing it. And we're not going to see all of it for sure. But, like I said, the children's Bibles, the other thing, white Jesus, pretty big problem, right, that we don't like to think about that often. But, that image of Jesus, you could probably picture it in your head right now, the kind of Aryan Jesus with kind of blue eyes, right? That image is the most reproduced human art object in the world.
Wow.
Right, that white Jesus. World War II soldiers were carrying that off to war with them, printed by the U.S. government. If they wanted to take it with them, and and a lot of white churches, I don't know if it's in here, a lot of white churches, like, in Jesus above the baptistry, he's a white guy, right? And so are all the biblical characters around there. And I think those things really matter. So it's kind of thinking about how do we kind of just take that seriously and kind of work that out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the challenge and for the hope that you also speak with. And let's give a round of applause. And thank you for your questions. And again, please stay for the reception in the gathering area. Purchase a book. Robert will sign it. You have a chance to further conversation with him in the gathering space. And you can grab some treats and go downstairs to have further conversation. And Pastor Denise Shear will lead that. From our racial justice team here at First Lutheran, will lead that conversation. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and I hope we continue to dialogue and come up with ways in which we can foster a different American future and leave all of this doctrine of discovery stuff behind. So thank you. Thank you very much for being here.